This is the webinar, Intersectionality of Sex Worker Rights, Trans Rights, and the Universal Periodic Review. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Our colleagues from New Jersey Red Umbrella Alliance will be tweeting through our account, our Twitter account, which is at BPPP. And the reason that NJRUA is tweeting through our account is because of a Twitter blocked the NJRUA account. And we'll talk about this more as we go along, but you know, the restrictions on speech in the United States, the speech of sex workers. But the reason that NJRUA was blocked from their Twitter account, which was a vital communication tool, was because they tweeted in Spanish using the hashtag COVID-19 and saying they tweeted in Spanish to the Spanish-speaking community of sex workers and people affected by sex work policies. They tweeted, if anyone in the community needs support during COVID-19, we're here for you. And that tweet caused New Jersey Red Umbrella Alliance to lose access to their account. So they're using our account today, which is at BPPP, but very soon they will have a new Twitter account, and we would all love it if everyone supported them on Twitter because of what they've been through. Twitter these days, as other forms of social media, are a vital communication tool. And as you'll hear in some of the presentations, for no reason or even for doing health-based outreach, sex worker-led and trans-led organizations and Black-led organizations can be blocked summarily. And it would be like having your phone cut off or ripped off in the past before, or having no way, or having the postal service cut off. It's as vital a form of communication. So that's NJRUA will be at the BPPP account, so please follow them on Twitter or tell your folks about that. They will be using their own Instagram today, which I believe is NJRUA. But we'll be sharing all of that in the chat as we get started. So let's get started. We've been getting some words of welcome through the chat, so thank you very much. And we're so glad that you're here. To introduce, the reason that we're here today is in advance of the Universal Periodic Review of the United States at the UN in Geneva. And what that mechanism is a human rights mechanism that looks at the overall human rights record of each country, and it happens every 5 years. The Universal Periodic Review of the United States was supposed to happen in May, but due to COVID-19 and other events, it's been delayed until November 9. We've received news that the US will be reviewed in the afternoon session on November 9. So, and that should be a session that you can view online and follow along. So you can watch how countries ask the United States questions and make recommendations at that live link. And once again, I'll send you that link in the chat. So for us as a network of sex worker rights organizations and trans-led organizations, the Universal Periodic Review is a way of having the community's voices heard. When the US government won't hear us or is very actively oppressing the communities, the Universal Periodic Review is a way of shining a light down from the global community on what is really happening inside the United States. One of the hashtags we're using today is, I believe, Read the US Report, and that comes from our colleagues at the US Human Rights Network. And it is important to look at the US report, which was very recently submitted. However, the US report says nothing about the reality of the day-to-day lives of citizens and people living in the United States, the people of the United States. And in specifically for us, it does not say anything about the communities of sex workers and trans people. So it's very important that we as civil society organizations let all our colleagues inside the US know what's happening in terms of human rights violations and proposed solutions, and the world know. Because what we really want to have happen here is that a mission, a permanent mission, or a government involved in the United Nations makes a recommendation to the US during the UPR about some of our issues. So as our speakers go forward today, you will hear them speak about the issues, introduce themselves and their work, and then speak about the issues and raise specific recommendations that could be made in the UN on November 9th. We know that all our allied organizations and community groups want to hear this too. And I know that we are united and working in solidarity about all of these issues. This is something we've worked on for 18 months. We have a lot of consensus and a lot of buy-in. So we're very excited to make our presentations to you today. So the speakers run will be, first we will hear the Black Sex Worker Collective, who will be joining us via recording due to an issue of a technical issue. They have to be here by recording. Then we will hear from Cris Sardina of Desiree Alliance. Then we will hear from Monica Jones of the Outlaw Project. Then I will give a little wrap up. My name's Penelope Saunders from the Best Practices Policy Project. And then we'd love to hear your questions or, we're happy to provide any detail about any recommendation that you may want to hear about or any issue that you want to hear about. So right now, I'm going to start the presentation from the Black Sex Worker Collective.
Hi, I am the incredible edible Akynos. I am the founder and executive director of the Black Sex Worker Collective, also known as the BSWC. I am a performance artist and writer and dancer and sex worker rights advocate. And I've been doing this work doing the advocacy work for over a decade, approximately a decade. And I've also been involved in many aspects of sex work industry for over 2 decades. BSWC was founded in 2018 as a response to the Cess Foster legislation, which was in part responsible for the closure of Backpage.com, the main site, which supported a lot of sex workers in advertising and keeping themselves safe. This was a result of conflating sex work with sex trafficking, which are two completely different issues. And it really affected sex workers, not just in the United States, but all across the globe. We are a philanthropic arts organization, and we provide support for current and former Black sex workers with mutual aid support, finances, to keep themselves in, safely in housing or with access to food, and just trying to have them not just survive, but also thrive within their lives. Because although we are in this trade, whether it's the illegal side of it or the side where it's legal, we should be entitled to have a thriving, beautiful life, and not just have the work that we do be about basic survival, which should be a human rights right. Okay. We have been involved with the UPR since 2015. And BSWC has been involved for the last 18 months on the reporting, design of outreach, communications, and recommendations, along with our coalition members, which are on this call today. Research shows that in jurisdictions in the US, that Black sex workers can make up the overwhelming majority of people arrested under loitering and anti-prostitution statutes, in some cases more than 90%. Policing specifically targets Black sex workers with extreme violence and rights violations, but it's often not highlighted in our human rights approaches when we consider policing in general. Given this, we are urging the international community to make recommendations that, like the United States, must cease the racist profiling of Black people, vigorously investigate police misconduct, and put an end to policing practices which targets Black sex workers. I want to take a moment right now to speak to the restrictions on speech and money that happens not only to Black sex workers, but also to Black people in general, which is really an intersectional issue on race, class, who should have access to money, who should have human rights, and so on. So, PayPal, along with traditional banking operations, tend to freeze accounts and legally steal the money of sex workers without warning. This can be done with just speculation that someone is engaging in activities that can be considered adult entertainment. This has happened to people who write adult-oriented material. Myself, as a performer who performs primarily in burlesque shows, have had my account frozen, and many other people like me. So this is not just limited to those who we might think are illegally performing acts of sexual services. This is for people whose work is actually legal, from dominatrixes to strippers and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of discrimination and violation of our rights to have access to money and to have money, even though we are also tax-paying citizens. So it is really common knowledge that banks, and yes, PayPal too, will totally freeze your account, and you will not have access to money, and there's no recourse in getting your money back, and the accounts will be permanently closed, and you can and will be blacklisted from using any of those services in the future. With the banks and PayPal being able to do this, this is an extension and deepening of practices in the US that allow police to take the money of people they profile as sex workers without recourse of the money ever being returned. And this money can be needed for different things such as rent, food, or anything for that matter. Because, you know, when we think about money and having access to money, as I said earlier, this is not just about our basic survival with having our basic needs met. Sometimes the needs that we have can be just to live a normal, happy life. And that just doesn't seem to matter when these corporations and these companies are deciding to withhold our money. However, this is also about the practice of the hatred of sex workers, not respecting who these people are, not respecting sex work being actual work, and not respecting that sex actually can be work. Additionally, which is also very similar, is how online speech is really restricted, especially in spaces like Facebook. Facebook is the kind of space where literally Black people and those in any form of industry, adult entertainment industry, or anything by extension, can say anything. We literally have our accounts blocked during times when we're fundraising to support somebody staying in housing or supporting someone in paying medical bills. There's no warning. There's no way to even fight the decision to close down our accounts or ban us for 30 days. That's usually the longest, or even for a few days, which can really be detrimental to how we function within our day-to-day society when we can't post on social media, because it's such a space where we can come together and be able to easily support each other on a global scale. Facebook is notorious for this. They are notorious for doing this to women. They are notorious for doing this to Black people, and they are notorious for doing this to sex workers. Literally, we cannot say anything. If anything can be interpreted as being about sex or being even mildly violent, even though we might be talking about smashing an orange, our accounts can be terminated or greatly restricted, and that has a really big effect on how we function. Fiscal sponsors as well are coming up to being a very traumatizing space for those in the sex worker community. Lots of microaggressions happen within the fiscal sponsor movement, and this can even be from fiscal sponsors who are also a part of the sex worker rights movement. because of discrimination, because of biases, because of stigma, because we actually don't really respect sex workers and we're not really doing the work to dismantle the oppressive mindset that we have around sex work. Fiscal sponsors is a big place of trauma for this community. Additionally, for the grassroots community as a whole, or for any of the groups that are working to try to pull themselves from the margins but are living at the margins. So fiscal sponsorship is definitely a space where we're getting abused. It's not really being spoken about right now in as much depth as it should be. Um, because it seems to be something kind of fairly new and quiet that people are not really trying to talk about, because no one wants to really disrupt the groove, because the fiscal sponsor holds so much power. But I think as time goes on, we're going to see a lot more stories coming out about how fiscal sponsorship spaces, which are supposed to be these spaces that support sex workers, where they're being incredibly abusive, incredibly oppressive, and in some cases stealing and really withholding the money of sex worker groups and groups at the margins. And this is a very dangerous thing that I hope that when we're making these recommendations that we can consider and try to propel the community better and try to work with destigmatizing every aspect of this industry. COVID-19 revealed a lot of discrimination towards the sex worker community. They denied workers money. They denied workers money to live. They denied workers money to support their families, support their children. They even denied them necessary medicine that they needed to stay healthy during the pandemic, forcing the hand of workers to risk their lives and risk the lives of their community to work, because government decided that this sector of people are not important. And if we're paying attention to what the application in the US was stated when people were applying for money, this even excluded people that worked in the legal aspects of the industry, such as nightlife entertainers, who may consider themselves to be adult entertainers because they do maybe strip or perform in adult oriented shows, but not in the illegal aspect of it. So a lot of people are, greatly affected by this if they're not in the formal, respectable trade of employment. And COVID-19 really, really revealed just how, not just how unimportant sex workers are, but just how anyone who can even remotely be perceived as being a part of the adult entertainment industry is treated. Additionally, how contradictory the system is, that even though there's aspects to this trade that is legal, that even when you are working on the legal aspect, that there's still going to be discrimination and you're still going to be left out of detrimental funds to keep you continuing in your day-to-day life. We urge the international community to make recommendations to the US along the lines of repealing legislative barriers, including FOSTA SESTA, which violate the freedom of assembly and association of sex workers so they may organize in defense of their health and rights and fundraise. Additionally, we want to stop the passage of the Earn It Act. Sex workers must be able to report police misconduct and violence while being protected from retaliation or further criminalization. State-sanctioned theft from sex workers must end. These are my recommendations. Again, I am the incredible edible Akynos from the Black Sex Worker Collective. We're based in New York as well as Berlin. Philanthropic arts organization trying to really change how we view and treat sex workers and how we treat anyone who may be working in the adult entertainment industry. I hope that you will take a moment to consider this and consider giving us a recommendation and supporting us, because sex worker rights are human rights, and sex worker rights are never just about sex workers. It is also about immigration. It is also about reproductive justice. It's about food justice, housing justice and security, and it is about the right of women to choose, right of women primarily, and the trans community to choose how they want to use their bodies. This work is never just one singular thing. It is multifaceted, and as we move into thinking about sex work, I want us to remember that this is a highly intersectional issue, and it definitely needs the attention and it needs the support in order to push our society forward. Thank you.
We're getting some comments from in the Twitter. People are making, I mean, in the chat, people are making connections between what has happened to New Jersey Red Umbrella Alliance and Akynos' speech. We've also received a message saying there is something called the 16 Days Campaign is a year focusing on informal workers and has a section on safety of sex workers. So we'll certainly look that up, and thank you for sharing that. And now I want to introduce you to our next speaker, who is Cris Sardina, the director of the Desiree Alliance. Cris, please introduce yourself and your organization and give us your presentation, which I know focuses on immigration. And I thank you very much.
Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Cris Sardina. I am the director of Desiree Alliance. Desiree Alliance is a national coalition of current and former sex workers working in conjunction with alliances that deal with on many levels, sex work and our human rights. So that being said, thank you, Akynos. That was a brilliant presentation. And I'd like to segue into immigration. Being from Tucson, Arizona, immigration is nothing new. It has been building for over a decade. It just didn't start with Trump's wall. It's been building and building through several administrations. So that being said, if you've ever been near the border wall, it is something to behold. It's monstrous. It's ugly. It's just I can't even describe it. That being said, being from Arizona, we've went from a small border patrol agency with a small building to approximately 1/2 of a site of an Air Force base. Our Davis-Monthan Air Force Base is a huge Air Force base, and it goes on for over a mile. They have built up with Border Patrol, ICE, and Homeland Security, and is now secured, and the military, which is now secured on Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And it also is a monstrosity of whatever. It's ugly. That being said, I'll get right into what I've been, this is nothing new for us. We've seen it over and over in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas and California, as the military has ramped up its participation with in conjunction with these federal agencies to target and harass and kill and what have you with the Border Patrol. So with that being said, this is a letter that I had wrote to the government of Mexico. So we're looking for recommendations from different countries on that. And Mexico, since immigration is near and dear to my heart, immigration, I've written and made contact with the government of Mexico for the United Nations. So that being said, I'll get right into it. I'm gonna go on and just read what I've written, and so there you go. Hold on just a second here. Can you hear me still?
Yes, you're loud and clear. Thank you, Cris.
Okay, thank you. So that being said, the southwestern border of the United States and Mexico has been declared a war zone, and security measures to keep terrorists out have increased beyond military standard measures to keep our borders safe. Efforts to accommodate migrations and immigrations in the United States have been met with open hostilities in a myriad of border policies enacted are alarmingly problematic in regards to current U.S. policies relating to prostitution, immigration, and migration. Migrant and immigrant sex workers are especially affected by these laws as they are under no protections of federal guidelines. Migrant and immigrant sex workers have been met with violence, sexual assaults, rogue, unregulated militia, deportations, violations of sensical immigration policies, and irrational management of such policies, laws, and regulations. Border Patrol agents have unlimited access to non-citizens with little supervisorial, good Lord, oversight in handling discipline when violations occur. A clear example of unregulated checks and balances referred to the case of Juan David Ortiz, a 10-year veteran and supervisor of the Texas Border Patrol in Laredo. Ortiz, in a span of 7 days, and I quote, cleaning up the streets from the scum of the earth, murdered 4 women working as prostitutes and attempting to murder a 5th victim who was able to escape from Ortiz. These women, all Hispanic, were repeatedly sexually and physically assaulted, held against their will, mentally brutalized, and then shot in the back of their heads and discarded in remote locations along the Texas-Mexico border. It is unclear if the border agent began his serial killing in a time frame of 1 week, or if his 10-year tenure as a state agent will produce more bodies of sex work thought disposable and insignificant to federal agencies. Border Patrol spokespeople dismissed the relevance of the heinous acts of Ortiz murder spree and instead focused on the premise that the agency should not be tarnished of, and I quote, the great work that our men and women do. Thousands of immigrant and migrant people are currently detained in inhumane cages across the United States. A multitude of children have been separated from families that have been deported without the possibilities of reconciliations. Migrant children are currently being adopted out in the United States because of ill-thought plans regarding these hastily placed policies of separation and reunification. A host of violations include, but not limited to, detention rape, separation, exploitations, isolations, harboring confinement, humans as fluid capital, forced labor, and other well-documented barbaric human rights violations executed by the United States government. We have steered away from our humanitarian and lawful obligations and handed it to those enforcing authoritative absolutism in our government. Current visa restrictions, targeted population bans, transportation bans, no-fly list, etc., harm families' abilities to assist one another, keep cultural ideologies that are necessary for well-being, and continued family binds. These punitive policies are not born out of common sense legalities. These enactments are born out of highly commercialized fear that is not based in law. The latest in atrocities are the forced hysterectomies approved by the Department of Homeland Security of childbearing women. During its first round of the Universal Periodic Review in 2010, the United States government accepted member state Uruguay Recommendation 86, calling on it to undertake awareness campaigns for combating stereotypes and violence against LGBT people and to ensure access to public services, paying special attention to the special vulnerability of sex work to violence and the human rights abuses. The US government has failed to live up to the promise of the latter of Recommendation 86, and its policies have worsened conditions for sex workers and related communities. Our communities face widespread criminalization, stigmatization, and violence, resulting in the deprivation of our human rights. Renewed pressure on the US government in the form of an informed recommendation by Mexico during the UPR would further the advancement of human rights for all. Recommendations on this issue to be made during the upcoming UPR include that of the United States should And this is our recommendations that Mexico should hit up the United States. And the criminalization of sex workers' lives by repealing laws, including recently enacted federal laws such as SESTA, FOSTA, and the Earn It Act that criminalize sex work and eliminate anti-prostitution policies and loitering measures that undermine protection of and respect for human rights of sex workers. Migrant and immigrant sex workers are especially affected by these laws as they are under no protection of federal guidelines and quite literally in harm's way, as our cases show. Vigorously investigate and put an end to policing practices targeting transgender people on the basis of them being suspected of being sex workers. Address the atrocities of current immigration and migration border policies in the United States that impact all immigrants, including sex workers at the border. Border guards and immigration officials should be held accountable for violating the human rights of people they profile as sex workers, and mechanisms should be put in place to prevent further harms, with special reference to the vulnerabilities that sex workers and transgender people face. The U.S. should remove participation in prostitution as grounds for removal from the country from the category of crimes of moral turpitude, as grounds for denying visas, legal status to individuals seeking to visit, reside in, or become citizens of the United States. Address the impact of the economy due to the Southwest border restrictions. Millions of dollars are being lost, impacting the way visitors shop and spend. And I'll go on that a little bit as people from Mexico come up to the United States and spend millions of dollars in US economy. So this is really being impacted, and Tucson's feeling this. And the last recommendation we're asking for is to begin a study of the impact of the border wall and the migrations patterns of wildlife. And so that being said, that is what Desiree Alliance is making the recommendations for. So I'm going to conclude that, and thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic, and right in the time limit. So Cris, fantastic. Please keep your comments coming. I've put a lot of resources in the chat. Our next speaker will be Monica Jones.
Thank you, Penelope. Hi, my name is Monica Jones. I am with the Outlaw Project, and I am based in Phoenix, Arizona. I've been a part of the UPR since 2015 and been to the last UPR. So I just want to talk about sex worker rights and COVID and the United States during the time of COVID. And so during the time of COVID, we see a lot of domestic workers are being impacted by COVID, right? And so we see fast food workers, restaurant workers, people who clean the hospitals are not recognized as essential workers and not recognized as those people who are heroes, and including sex workers. And sex work is a legitimate form of work. We are healers, we are social workers, we are therapists, and we provide many services outside of sex in general. And so sex workers are definitely impacted by COVID. And also when we talk about the disparities in COVID, we must understand that like marginalized individuals are particularly impacted by COVID. And at the beginning of COVID, at the epidemic, we realized that Black communities were directly impacted by COVID. And this is like in Louisiana, even though African Americans make up 33% of the population, but they made up 70% of the people who died from COVID in Louisiana alone. And this is due to the historical trauma that Black bodies have endured through our time in the US. This is like, there has been studies that show that trauma has been stored in the body and the distrust against healthcare providers. And I want you guys to look up the Tuskegee program where Black bodies were used as test subjects to study the progression of untreated syphilis and the human body. Black women have been used as test subjects too. And so we have a distrust with the doctors. And so this relief this adds on to Black bodies as casualties of COVID, because the US has not reconciled those differences and those instances of violence and harms that the African American communities have faced during our history here in the US. And sex workers face these issues as well, right? Where sex workers are being shut out of places that we usually occupy to work, such as bars, hotel lobbies, online, and having those things shut down. And also, like, we can't advertise freely through Twitter. We can't advertise freely through our Facebook. We can't advertise freely through Instagram because our accounts are being shut down. And we don't have the proper access to PPEs. And yes, we have widely spread face masks, but we don't have the NR95 masks that are available to healthcare workers, but not to the general public. And so these create disparities when it comes to sex workers who have to choose to work during the time of COVID. And so, a lot of individuals rely on those harm reduction services out in our community, like grassroots harm reductions for proper PPEs and access to condoms and access for general support. And our resources are being exhausted. So a lot of sex worker rights organizations are trying to do mutual aid and raising money to provide mutual aid to sex workers. And trans women, especially trans women of color, are directly impacted due to COVID, right? But also when people are engaging in street-based sex work, we see that a lot of heavy policing of trans individuals who engage in street-based sex work as a choice. And we see that there are a lot of harassments, a lot of arrests under these anti-prostitution laws, right? And so we have like we have the manifestation law in Phoenix, Arizona, which is a city ordinance that directly impact marginalized and poor communities. We have the loitering with the intent in New York City. And these laws are remnants of the Jim Crow era as sundown laws. We have the vagrancy laws that were out during Jim Crow that directly push people into the prison industrial system. So COVID has seen people being pushed into the prison industrial system still, right? You might not get arrested right away, but once this thing is over, once COVID is over, or once the business can get back up and the courts are reopened, people still have summonings into court. And like especially when it comes to trans bodies, right? We are here and we are in the margins across the world. No matter if you are the most liberal country, still trans people are still in the margins, where we see the highly, especially here in the US, Black and immigrant trans women are being killed at a higher rate. And this is due to what we call interpersonal violence. When people it's people within our own same communities, the communities that we work in, clients that are killing us. And so this is intensified due to COVID and people stress, and people really want to take it out on someone. And so you hurt people. And so who you can hurt is the people who are deemed underneath you, right? And so this is the same thing that happens in the prison system, where prison guards are just people out in the streets, but when they're in prison, the prison system, they are someone higher than the prisoners themselves. And so hurt people. And when it comes to like Sesta and Foster has always been in our future. We see this with the anti-prostitution laws that happen, with like the manifestation laws that I keep mentioning, and the loitering with attempt condoms as evidence. But these laws directly impacted street-based sex workers. And so while people who were engaging in online work said that they didn't have to deal with that, but street-based workers had to deal with that. And Sesta and Foster is the echo of that direct impact on street-based sex workers. And street-based sex workers during this time of COVID still have to work. Trans people still have to work. Our income, the average income of a Black trans woman is less than $10,000. And that is low. And when you come into places like New York, DC, Seattle, and LA, where the rent is much higher than that a year, right? And so trans women have to subsidize their income, because we still can be discriminated against. Even though the Supreme Court just said that we can't discriminate based on gender, there's still states that are still have the right to work states, and they can just fire you just because. And we're not protected until we all are protected. And when it comes to sex work, I want to close this off. When it comes to sex work, we must understand that sex work is an essential part of our human day and everyday life. It is essential to people who may not have access to relationships, and for people who have learning disabilities, for people who may have issues with interaction with people, sex worker provide a service to those individuals. And also, sex work is a non-discriminatory job. You can be someone who is Black. You can be someone who's a person with a disability. You can be someone who has a physical disability like an amputee, and you still can make money and make a living and thrive in sex work, because there's someone for everyone in sex work. And so we should recognize it as a legitimate form of sex work. And I'm going to close out with our recommendation. We have recommendation 86 that our partners as best practices got Uruguay to give to the US. The US accepted recommendation 86, but they have not done anything to implement that. Actually, they did things to roll back protections. And so mass arrest of sex workers, Sesta and Foster. And we also want to that let everyone in the US have access to the stimulus package. Even undocumented workers should have access to the stimulus package, because they give in to our economy. Sex workers give in to our economy. And we should stop the profiling of Black and brown bodies in the US, and also stop the policing of trans lives, especially using the anti-prostitution laws to police Black and brown trans people. Thank you. My name is Monica Jones with the Outlaw Project.
Thank you, Monica. We are now at the end of our presentations. I'm just going to give a little summation from the Best Practices Policy Project. I wanted to remind everyone that if you want to follow up on these issues, we have the following hashtags. I want to speak to why these issues at the United Nations are important for us. If you look here, hang on, let me just get rid of my video so it's a little clearer. Okay, so all our organizations in varying capacities as sex worker rights organizations and trans organizations have been deeply involved in the Universal Periodic Review since the beginning. In 2010, my group, Best Practices, worked with Desiree Alliance to submit the very first national report about the human rights of sex workers to this process, and it was the very first UPR. As a result of submitting that nationwide report, we had a chance to travel to Geneva, and we, in those times, we could speak with policymakers and governments and passionately convey our issues in person, which obviously is very difficult right now. But back then in 2010, we could sit down with people and explain our issues, and it makes all the difference. Uruguay made a recommendation, which we've all mentioned, which is recommendation 86. And once a recommendation is made through the Universal Periodic Review process, which is a 2-hour live process in the UN where missions stand up and make recommendations to the United States. Once that recommendation is made, it's not a done deal. We still need to do follow-up activism inside the United States after the fact to pressure the United States to accept the recommendation, because the United States does not accept all recommendations. And we did that activism across the nation. And in 2011, the US accepted recommendation 86, which I will repeat, you've heard it from a couple of other speakers, but this recommendation, it requires, it's not an option, it requires the United States to undertake awareness raising campaigns for combating stereotypes and violence against gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and trans people, and ensure access to public services. And in this, the United States must pay attention to the special vulnerability of sex workers to violence and human rights abuses. So this is not, just to be clear, this is not that the US could maybe do this, maybe think about it. The US has signed an international agreement to do it. Obviously, the US has not done it. Since recommendation 86, the US has pursued policies that directly contradict this commitment, putting sex workers and any community profiled by under anti-prostitution policies at heightened risks of human rights abuses. And that is the essence of all of our presentations today. You've heard about the impact of COVID-19. You've heard about the impact and intersectionality of immigration policies and the deaths of community members at the hands of state agents, such as prison guards, such as border guards, such as the police. You have heard that violent policing in particular targets Black sex workers. Obviously, all sex workers are targeted, but Black sex workers are violently targeted by the police, and trans sex workers and transgender people as well. So recommendations in these areas would be straightforward to make and easy to make, and they can be made. So all of our issues have been laid out, and we're ready for the international community to come and support us and to make these recommendations. One thing I would say to close out these issues is the reason that we called our session intersectional is because there is a fiction that sex workers are an isolated group, somehow separated from other parts of society. But everywhere you find human rights issues, you will find that sex workers are there, often being the most impacted by the human rights abuses. If you think about the issue of HIV, when HIV is criminalized, the people who are most impacted are people doing sex work and trans people. So wherever there are human rights abuses, sex workers are in those categories of persons being violated, and because of whorephobia combined with xenophobia, transphobia, and racism, sex workers are severely harmed. So I would like to close out by saying that the communities mentioned by all of our organizations can't wait. People are dying. People's lives are on the line. And as to bring it back to the Black Sex Worker Collective's presentation, this is a set of communities that doesn't want to be defined by human rights abuses. Sex workers want to work, benefit from their labor, and live their lives. But with all these barriers in place, there's a human rights crisis ending the lives of very valuable community members, parents, family members, immigrants, contributors to society, and these abuses must stop. And we can only do this in partnership with allied organizations and with the global community. So thank you very much. Please send your questions. We would love to hear them, and we are looking forward to having a discussion with you. Does anyone, Nigella, were there any questions or comments coming through from social media?
Hi, there are currently no questions yet, but I am checking all the hashtags to see if somebody might have made a comment using one of them, but I haven't seen it yet.
We do see a comment from Cris, and Cris is saying, has written to the panelists, the US just responded to the 2015 UPR, and it was horrible. They failed to acknowledge any violations, and the immigration response was a hard sell on the humane treatment of captured migrants seeking asylum. They were also heavy-handed on the trafficking narrative, connecting it to the border. And
Can I speak to that?
Go ahead, Cris.
The UPR began in 2010 for the United States. It was the first time the United States was up for their human rights review. And so most of us on this panel have been working on it since the beginning until the latest. But to let it be known, the US is up for review every 5 years. So we've been working on 2010, 2015, and 2020. And this we just don't start, a month before. We work on it the year before in order to get these countries to make recommendations. So we all work really hard on selling ourselves to get recommendations like recommendation 86. Well, the US is supposed to respond to these reports once they've accepted or not accepted the recommendations. And so the US just responded to their 2015 report. And although it was written clearly and well, the soft sell and the hard sell of their immigration policies, you wouldn't think butter would melt in our mouth. Seriously, it was just horrible the way they explained it, how humane it was, and we're doing everything we can. And if you read my if you listen to my presentation, this isn't at all what's really happening. And this is the same with the, they managed to get the trafficking narrative in there, and it was, they connected it to the border policies, that this was, the reason why to stop the human trafficking. But those of us who live in the border states know that it's been going on for, for as long as people have been migrating. And so sometimes you cannot separate human trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking at the border. It all enmeshes together. But what they've managed to do is cherry pick sex trafficking out of it, because nobody really cares if people clean our pool or clean our hotels or work in the kitchens in our restaurants. That's not important. It doesn't have the shock factor. and human trafficking is far removed on what people really want to believe. But if you look at sex trafficking, it's a really shock factor, it's a fear factor, and now it's in under every rock, under every tree, behind every building. They're coming toward you in your small towns, your large towns, and it's everywhere. So the U.S. is gearing up with the FOSTA-SESTA and the Earn It Act. I would suggest it would be Technical Patriot Act, because the US is trying to control the entirety of the WWW, the World Wide Web. And it's just another, you're either with us or against us. So I just kind of wanted to point that out on how the US responded to the 2015 recommendations of the UN countries making these recommendations that the US needs to look at. So since it was 5 years ago and they just now responded, I'm not quite sure what this administration, if it's, how we're going to either transfer that power or continue on the same lines. Don't forget to vote. I'll put it out there right now. Please vote. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Monica or Akynos, who is here but may not be able to speak from Europe, but do you have anything that you would like to reiterate, or anything that, now that you have a bit more time, you'd like to add?
No, I just think that if you came to this webinar, we asked you to take this into heart and demand that the U.S. give protection to sex workers in this country. That's it.
Akynos, I'll wait for a moment and see if you unmute. I'll see if you unmute and are able to speak. If not, we have your presentation and that will certainly be available up online. Yeah, there may be some issues coming in from Europe in terms of communication. So that's why we had to do a pre-recording. Someone is asking, hi panelists, I asked a queue which is in the queue. Oh wait, there is one here. I'm so sorry. Here is the question. We do have a question. It says, SESTA Foster is inspiring prohibitionist anti-sex worker movements around the world, which is a really scary thought. What recommendations do you have for sex worker movements and their supporters in other parts of the world where these policies have not yet taken root, while there's still time to stop them? So essentially, Foster and SESTA is spreading like
Wildfire.
Invasive weed.
We have the Nordic model too. The Nordic model is everywhere. I mean, as globally, it has picked up speed. People are, on the bandwagon for the Nordic model. Don't criminalize the poor sex worker. Let's criminalize the buyer. So we're seeing that more globally, and a lot of organizations, global organizations, have resisted that and continue to do pretty much the same things as the United States is doing. We're just pushing against it. And, because you cannot criminalize the buyer without targeting the seller. So, as with anything, when you have capitalism, you're going to have clandestine markets that also counter that. So, as we get pushed further underground, more violence, more criminalizations and things like that. So we're going to have to, just keep pushing against the Nordic model, because more and more groups and more anti-trafficking groups are really, conflating the numbers. There's 100,000. Now there's one. I just read one in 130 people, mostly women and children, are being sex trafficked. I mean, good Lord, you just don't know it. You're being trafficked right now. So this is something that we really have to hold these anti-trafficking organizations responsible, and for you know, for the way they marketed and advertise the Nordic model. So that's what I got to say about that.
Yeah. I think what people should do is pay attention and support US-based sex workers to end the Sesta and Foster laws that are in place. But also the US has inspired a lot of global policies or global events, such as when during the early 1900s, where immigrant workers used to come across the border and they used to have to get sprayed with chemical spray to get because of lice. And those same facilities were used by the Germans and at concentration camps to inspire the gas chambers. And so the US has had policies and procedures that impacted other countries or inspired other countries since the beginning. And so we should understand that, like, yes, we are the US, but our policies in other countries would take our policies and implement those policies very harshly. And so we need the support of the global community to fight the Sesta and Foster. When we were asking the other sex worker organizations outside the US, hey, we really need your help. We really need your funding. We were ignored. People were saying that we were confrontational, but we need the support and we also need the funding.
We do have another question coming through, which I will read out in just a moment. Thank you for your question. I see it. Now I've figured out that there's also stuff going to the Q&A. I would like to comment on the foster and Sesta question from a slightly different angle. We worked prior to the UPR report, best practices had an opportunity to work with Northeastern Law School. And the students and professors there helped us develop a human rights approach to foster and Sesta, additional commentary. We all know, or we're becoming more aware that human trafficking as a discourse can be a smokescreen for a lot of abuses, and also would fool otherwise concerned human rights activists into supporting militarizing the police. So we've always got to be very careful with the sex trafficking and human trafficking discourse, because it smooths the way for people to accept militarization and direct incarceration and human rights abuses of whole communities without protest. And that is not acceptable. So whenever you're looking at a human trafficking program, you have to ask yourself, who's being funded here? Why are the police being given military grade weapons and vehicles? Why? How does that stop human trafficking? And go behind the discourse and question it. So that's, I think, an analysis that's out there. But the additional analysis, which I think is quite important, and it's in our report, is that it's a freedom of assembly issue, and a speech issue, and a how would you frame it? A right to speak, a right to organize. So for me, that's an important point, because part of the discrimination against sex workers is sex workers are victims who cannot speak for themselves. But if we go into human rights and look at our right to organize, which is a human right, and our right to assemble, which is something that's both a right in the United States and in international human rights law, Foster and Sesta, these bills preventing online speech, undermine those human rights. And that helps you frame the human rights issues from a perspective that sex workers are subjects organizing their own lives and organizing in organizations for rights, and not simply victims who can be taken care of by being arrested. So I think that's something fairly new in human rights discourse, and that's in our report. So I encourage you to have a look at that. Also, when you think about foster and sester, we essentially, just like any other oppressive framework, it emboldens other organizations to do things. And there's a report in a report that we received a couple of reports where organizations holding the money for sex workers, fiscal sponsors, which is what Akynos spoke about, who were emboldened under foster and sester to just keep the sex worker organization's money, just to steal it. And that wouldn't happen if structures such as foster and sester did not exist. So it's also got a broader effect, emboldening organizations and individuals to perpetrate rights violations against sex workers' communities. So that's my additional comment. I hope that didn't take up too much time. Let me read the next question. Hang on one second. The next question says, thank you all for your fantastic presentations. Since child sex trafficking is often used as a smokescreen to punish adult sex workers and the rescue industry is, well, a mess, what are the legit organizations that work against child trafficking? I'd like to say, and I'm not sure if anyone dropped off there, there was a bit of a silence, but I'd like to say there are doing direct services for people under the age of 18 is not something that I personally do now, but in the past, I have been involved in service providers that have done that. And I would say that locally, in local jurisdictions in the United States, there are often LGBT organizations that are better at assisting young people. However, it can be quite problematic because there has been such a failure to provide services to trans youth. But I think if you look at trans organizations working to provide services to the community, when those organizations can, they're also providing support to youth to get them into housing, to help them with the court. I know that's something that we certainly did at different avenues. So I would look beyond organizations with trafficking in their names. I would look to progressive immigrant rights organizations. You know, some immigrant rights organizations have begun to accept the trafficking framework, but most of them resist it because they know what border control looks like and they know what policing looks like. So they don't want to go to work on anti-trafficking quite that way. So I would look to migrants' rights organizations as well. I don't know if any of our other speakers have any recommendations on better organizations, but I would say if you're working with a group that says child sex trafficking in its title or mission, you should very much ask them what they're doing, because often it is a smokescreen simply to violate the rights of other sex workers. And you may need to go to groups that don't have that title in their name. Service providers, housing, trans groups, LGBT, immigrants groups, and of course, sex worker rights groups do great work in this area. Streetwise and Safe did pretty good work in New York. That's a good example.
And you've also got to look at follow the money. I mean, where is the money going? We have, you know, these anti-trafficking organizations that you know, tout children, but yet there is no funding for them. There are no resources. There is there's not a lot for youth. So that being said, and that being said, you know, just follow the money. Where is the money going? Is it going to youth? What are they doing with the youth? Are they holding them hostage as well? So a lot of times these anti-trafficking organizations hold youth, you know, hostage. They're not allowed to, and a lot of it's faith-based. Nothing wrong with that, I guess. But you know, when you're putting these conditions on youth that are out there for various reasons, the foster care system, the very systems that are harming them or or forcing them to go back home where there's abuse there. And so, you know, you really got to do your homework on that. What is happening with the youth? What are they doing? Are they helping them, or are they pushing them farther into the margins? So, you know, into the hands of third parties and such. So you got to really look at how these organizations that specifically put youth in their narrative to really do your homework. What are they doing for the youth?
I remembered a great model as well, which is YWEP, Young Women's Empowerment Project. Unfortunately, YWEP, you know, I think was for about a decade and then had to close. And these organizations that work at the intersection of sex work or prostitution, policing, and what youth need, are very frequently closed because of lack of funding, because there's only one narrative that can be used, which is, you know, youth cannot speak for themselves, cannot represent themselves, and anyone who would express a view that perhaps engaging in, you know, sexual exchanges is anything other than a 100% rights abuse rather than a survival strategy for youth who are really at risk for any number of things is shut down. So it's very difficult for youth to speak about this. I would say though, if you look at children's rights, there's a notion of evolving rights as children get older, evolving rights to speak, to engage in human rights discourses. So these, you know, there's the notion of the evolving rights of the child as the child moves towards adulthood. And in that, I think that youth can speak and represent their own experiences. However, you are only rewarded as someone speaking on this if you put forth a very carceral, very pro-police, very, you know, that kind of discourse. Anyone who's saying anything else is not going to be rewarded with funding or support. But I would look at YWEP. That's a good place to start for at least models. So we have another question, which I'll read out. The questioner says, thank you for these presentations. For feminist groups who are working on Beijing 25 and 26 and the Generation Equality Action Coalitions, what is your advice to us? These are important meetings that set the global normative framework for gender justice across all areas, even though we know, as with the UPR, recommendations can be made, but there is no accountability for governments. Before we answer this question, I would like to say that some of our groups here do work annually at the Commission on the Status of Women. We usually hold a parallel session in New York where we promote perspectives. Right now, none of our groups have ECOSOC status, so we are not in a position to present our own individual statements to the United Nations. So what can you do? You can include us in your reports, because right now we don't have the official standing in front of the UN in New York City to present our own words. Now that's going to change. Like, some of our groups are working towards getting this status, but that's something that you can do right now. Give us access to the UN, give us, include our points in your perspective. Obviously in the Beijing statements and platforms, there has always been a struggle over an effort to make it a kind of anti-prostitution feminism. And we, you know, there's a lot of histories written about that you can look at. And, you know, you have to be vigilant in these spaces because often we don't have access. And that's something else I want to add here about us having this online webinar, is even when things are not shut, even when organizations are not shut down or the UN is not shut down due to COVID-19, not everyone has equal access. Transgender leaders from our coalition have been denied access through misgendering at the doors at the United Nations. I think it was last year or the year before when we went to the CSW, one of our leaders who is Black, trans, and disabled found it very hard to enter the United Nations because there were no wheelchairs available and very limited access for people with disabilities. So how can you help us have access? How can you include your materials in your statements? How can you support us with funding to go to these meetings? Anyway, I'll throw it to the rest of the speakers, but I just wanted to say this is something that we do work on. And with the folks working on Beijing, Beijing platforms and declarations and the CSW, we'd be happy to follow up with you later, give you more information. The other thing I would say is, you know, allied groups, please work with us in a way that we can do. All of us are volunteer. There are no paid leaders here. We have very limited resources. Sometimes our telecommunications are cut off for reasons that we've listed here, but also because of lack of funds to pay a phone bill. So please work with us in ways, you know, give us time to respond. If we don't respond to an email, try our phone, try our social media. You know, our abilities are limited because we're systematically shut out. There's a comment here from an attendee. It says, on point like always, Cris. I said it in January directly to the State Department. They have allowed someone whose whole family history of money stems from trafficking of women and children. They allowed a pedophile rapist into power, and they have the nerve to come to us with violence disguised as saving children. All the while they are stealing our children at the border and selling them into their worldwide sex trafficking ring, and nobody in the international community is doing anything about it. Well, yes, hypocrisy, for sure. Let me indicate that that question is done. We've answered 3 questions. It's 10 minutes before we officially end. We're happy to end a little early. If all of your questions have been answered, please let us know. Oh, I see a couple of people are raising your hands. I can't give you permission to speak. Could you please type in a question? If there is a barrier to typing, and I understand that might be, hold up your hand again and I will give you permission to speak. I know some people, you know, there might be a barrier, so raise your hand again if that's the case. Otherwise, type a question. Oh, the person said, sorry, raising my hand was a mistake. But good to see you here, and thank you for letting me say that. Well, it's been a long morning and a lot of preparation for us. So I think I'm going to throw it to the speakers to say your goodbyes and to thank New Jersey Red Umbrella Alliance for all the support work that you've done. But I'd like to thank Desiree Alliance, the Outlaw Project, Black Sex Worker Collective as well for your presentations. BPPP, I'll thank ourselves. But please say anything else by way of goodbye, and everyone stay in touch, okay?
Don't forget to vote.
Looks like we lost Monica along the way. She may have had another meeting to go to. I thank everyone for coming and for being such a marvelous audience and for participating so much. And we will be sending you out more information. And we thank you for partnering with this work and just to have an audience to be heard. Like, it's so meaningful to us. So thank you for showing up. Nigel is putting some more links back into the chat for you. Please use this material and please follow us online. I'll be sending out all of that information in an email as well. Nigel, you got any closing comments?
Oh, I just want to thank everybody who participated and retweeted. Unfortunately, we didn't get a lot of people asking questions, but we did get a lot of participation. And I hope that you will check out BPPP's Twitter, because I've put links to all of our key recommendations, as well as a link to our full report that you can read.
And hopefully see you all on November 9, watching the UN and countries hold the US accountable. And when those countries hold the US accountable, don't forget behind every recommendation, there's a bunch of people pushing for it. So they really are recommendations too. Okay, I'm gonna end the session. See you later.